The autumn rain hammered against the tall windows of Silverstone Palace as Princess Elena stood before the ornate mirror in her chambers, adjusting the emerald necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. Today marked the 10th anniversary of her father King Marcus's reign over the prosperous kingdom of Astoria, but the celebration felt hollow to her. Dark rumors had been circulating through the palace corridors for weeks. Whispers that made her stomach churn with worry and disbelief. At 26, Princess Elena possessed both the sharp intelligence inherited from her scholarly mother and the fierce determination that ran through the royal bloodline. Her younger brother, Prince Alexander, barely 22, had always been the charming favorite among the court nobles, but lately his behavior had become increasingly erratic. Their father, King Marcus, seemed oblivious to the growing tensions within his own family, focusing instead on trade negotiations with neighboring kingdoms and the upcoming harvest festivals. The source of Elena's concerns centered around Lady Victoria Blackwood, her father's chief advisor and longtime confidant. Victoria had served the crown for over 15 years, rising from a minor noble's daughter to become one of the most powerful figures in the kingdom. She possessed an elegant beauty that had captivated many suitors, but her true passion lay in political maneuvering and accumulating influence behind the scenes. 3 months earlier, Elena had accidentally discovered correspondence in Lady Victoria's private study that suggested financial irregularities within the royal treasury. The documents, hastily hidden when Elena entered the room unexpectedly, contained references to foreign accounts and coded messages that made no sense for legitimate royal business. When Elena had attempted to discuss her concerns with her father, Victoria had been present and had smoothly deflected the conversation toward other matters. More troubling were the late-night meetings Elena had observed between Lady Victoria and Prince Alexander. Her brother had always been somewhat rebellious, but recently he had been asking pointed questions about royal succession laws and the procedures for transferring power in cases of royal incapacity. These conversations, combined with his sudden interest in military affairs and palace security procedures, painted a disturbing picture that Elena hoped was simply her imagination running wild. The anniversary celebration was scheduled to begin in 2 hours, with guests arriving from across the kingdom and several neighboring realms. King Marcus had planned an elaborate ceremony in the Great Hall, followed by a feast that would demonstrate Astoria's prosperity and stability to international observers. Elena understood the importance of projecting strength, especially given the recent border disputes with the aggressive kingdom of Drakmor to the north. As Elena prepared to join her family for the pre-celebration briefing, her lady-in-waiting Sarah approached with obvious nervousness. Sarah had been Elena's closest friend since childhood, and her distressed expression immediately put the princess on alert. In hushed tones, Sarah reported that she had overheard servants discussing unusual activity in the palace's lower levels, including the movement of weapons and the presence of armed men, who were not part of the regular guard. The revelation sent ice through Elena's veins. If Sarah's information was accurate, someone was planning something significant for tonight's celebration, when the palace would be filled with dignitaries and the royal family would be most vulnerable. Elena's mind raced through the possibilities, each scenario more frightening than the last. She needed to warn her father immediately, but she also needed concrete evidence that would convince him to take action against his most trusted advisor. Elena made a decision that would change everything. Instead of joining the family briefing, she would use the next hour to investigate the lower levels of the palace herself. If she could gather proof of whatever plot was unfolding, she might be able to prevent a disaster that could destroy not only her family but the entire kingdom. Sarah reluctantly agreed to cover for her absence, understanding the gravity of the situation despite her fears for Elena's safety. The ancient stone passages beneath Silverstone Palace had been built centuries earlier as escape routes during times of siege, but they had fallen into disuse as the kingdom had enjoyed decades of peace. Elena moved carefully through the dimly lit corridors, her heart pounding as she followed the sounds of muffled voices echoing from somewhere ahead. What she discovered in those forgotten chambers would shatter her faith in the people she had trusted most and force her to make choices that would determine the fate of everyone she loved. As the Celebration preparations continued above. Elena crept closer to the source of the voices, pressing herself against the cold stone wall to remain hidden. The conversation she overheard would reveal the true scope of the betrayal that threatened to tear apart the kingdom of Astoria from within, setting in motion a series of events that would test every relationship and loyalty she had ever known. Elena's blood ran cold as she recognized the voices echoing through the stone chamber ahead. Lady Victoria's cultured tones mixed with Prince Alexander's familiar laugh, but there was something sinister in their conversation that made her press closer to the wall. Hidden behind a massive stone pillar, she strained to hear every word of what was clearly a clandestine meeting taking place. Just hours before the anniversary celebration, the chamber had been converted into a makeshift command center, with maps spread across rough wooden tables and several men in dark clothing standing at attention. Elena counted at least 8 figures, none of whom she recognized as palace guards or regular staff. Their weapons and military bearings suggested they were mercenaries or soldiers from outside Astoria, which raised terrifying questions about who had hired them and for what purpose. Lady Victoria stood at the center of the group, her elegant gown replaced by practical dark clothing that allowed for easier movement. She held a detailed layout of the palace in her hands, pointing to specific locations while giving instructions in a voice that carried absolute authority. Elena realized with growing horror that Victoria was directing these armed strangers through the security arrangements for tonight's celebration, identifying weak points and optimal positions for whatever they were planning. Prince Alexander paced nervously near the edge of the group, his youthful face showing excitement mixed with apprehension. Elena had always known her brother possessed ambition, but she had never imagined he would betray their father so completely. When he spoke, his words confirmed her worst fears about the scope of their conspiracy and his willing participation in whatever plot was unfolding. The plan, as Elena gradually pieced it together from their conversation, was breathtakingly audacious and deeply personal. Lady Victoria and Prince Alexander intended to use tonight's celebration to stage what would appear to be a tragic accident, eliminating King Marcus and positioning Alexander as the grief-stricken heir who would need Victoria's guidance to navigate the kingdom through its crisis. The foreign mercenaries would ensure no witnesses survived to contradict their version of events. Elena's mind reeled as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. Her brother was planning to murder their father, while the woman who had helped raise them both orchestrated the entire conspiracy. The realization that 2 people she loved and trusted were capable of such betrayal felt like a physical blow, leaving her struggling to maintain her composure while hidden in the shadows. The conversation revealed additional layers of deception that made the situation even more complex. Lady Victoria had been secretly communicating with King Roderick of Drakmore, offering to deliver Astoria's strategic territories in exchange for military support and recognition of her position as regent. Prince Alexander, apparently unaware of this aspect of the plan, believed he would truly rule the kingdom after their father's death. Not realizing he was merely a pawn in Victoria's larger game, Elena discovered that the financial irregularities she had noticed months earlier were part of an extensive embezzlement scheme that had been funding this conspiracy for over a year. Victoria had been systematically draining the royal treasury while building a private army and purchasing the loyalty of key nobles who would support Alexander's claim to the throne. The scope of the betrayal extended far beyond just 2 conspirators, to include a network of corrupt officials throughout the kingdom. The most chilling moment came when Elena overheard Victoria discussing contingency plans for dealing with potential obstacles to their success. Princess Elena herself was identified as a significant threat, someone whose intelligence and popularity among the people could complicate their narrative if she survived the night's events. The casual way Victoria discussed eliminating her made Elena realize that her childhood mentor viewed her as nothing more than a problem to be solved. As the meeting began to conclude, Elena knew she had limited time to act on the information she had gathered. The conspirators were preparing to move to their positions for the evening's celebration, which meant she had perhaps 30 minutes to warn her father and organize some kind of defense. However, she also understood that simply running to King Marcus with accusations would not be sufficient, especially given Victoria's influence over him and the lack of physical evidence to support her claims. Elena made the difficult decision to remain hidden until the conspirators departed, hoping to gather physical proof that would convince her father to take immediate action. She watched as Victoria distributed final instructions in small bags of gold to the mercenaries, creating a paper trail that might serve as evidence if she could retrieve it. The sight of her brother accepting his own payment for betraying their family would haunt her for years to come. When the chamber finally emptied, Elena emerged from her hiding place with her hands shaking but her resolve strengthened. She had perhaps 20 minutes before the celebration began. 20 minutes to gather evidence and find a way to save her father's life while exposing the conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The next few hours would determine whether the kingdom of Astoria would survive the night or fall to the ambitions of those closest to its heart. Elena moved swiftly through the abandoned chamber, gathering the scattered papers and maps that the conspirators had left behind in their haste. Her hands trembled as she photographed the documents with a small camera she had learned to use for documenting historical artifacts, understanding that physical evidence would be crucial if she hoped to convince anyone of the incredible betrayal she had witnessed. The maps clearly showed planned positions throughout the Great Hall, with specific markings indicating where the mercenaries would be stationed during the celebration. Time was running desperately short as Elena made her way back through the stone passages toward the main palace. She could hear the sounds of arriving guests and the bustle of final preparations echoing through the walls, reminding her that hundreds of innocent people would soon be gathering in the same space where murder was planned. Her mind raced through possible courses of action, each option carrying enormous risks and uncertain outcomes. The most direct approach would be to confront her father immediately with the evidence she had gathered. But Elena knew that King Marcus's trust in Lady Victoria ran incredibly deep. After 15 years of faithful service, Victoria had earned a position of influence that would make accusations against her seem like desperate attention-seeking from a jealous daughter. Elena needed more than documents and photographs. She needed witnesses or some form of irrefutable proof that would overcome her father's natural skepticism. As she reached the main levels of the palace, Elena encountered Captain James Morrison, the head of the royal guard who had served her family since before her birth. Captain Morrison possessed both unwavering loyalty and the tactical experience necessary to handle the security crisis that was about to unfold. But convincing him to act against Lady Victoria and Prince Alexander would require extraordinary evidence and careful presentation of the facts. Elena pulled Captain Morrison aside into a small antechamber, showing him the photographs and maps while explaining what she had overheard in the underground meeting. The grizzled veteran listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave as he studied the evidence and processed the implications of the conspiracy. His years of military service had taught him to recognize genuine intelligence when he saw it, and Elena's documentation was too detailed and specific to be fabricated. The captain's response was swift and decisive. He immediately began deploying trusted guards to discreet positions throughout the Great Hall, creating a counter-surveillance network that would monitor the areas marked on the conspirators' maps. However, he cautioned Elena that they needed to be extraordinarily careful, as alerting the wrong person could trigger the attack prematurely, or allow the conspirators to escape before justice could be served. Together, they developed a plan that would allow the celebration to proceed while positioning loyal guards to intercept the mercenaries when they moved into action. Captain Morrison identified several of his most trusted subordinates, who could be brought into the operation without risking leaks to potential conspirators within the palace staff. Elena would remain close to her father throughout the evening, ready to shield him from danger while signaling the captain if the situation escalated beyond their ability to control. The most painful aspect of their plan involved allowing Prince Alexander to proceed with his role in the conspiracy until the last possible moment. Elena struggled with the knowledge that her brother was actively planning their father's murder, but Captain Morrison convinced her that premature action could force the conspirators to accelerate their timeline. or abandon their current plan in favor of something even more dangerous. They needed to catch the entire network in the act to prevent future attempts. As the celebration began, Elena took her place beside King Marcus on the royal dais, her elegant smile masking the turmoil that churned in her stomach. She watched Lady Victoria move gracefully through the crowd, greeting dignitaries and managing protocol with her usual efficiency, while knowing that the woman was simultaneously orchestrating the murder of everyone Elena loved. The contrast between Victoria's public persona and her true nature was both fascinating and horrifying. Prince Alexander appeared nervous as he fulfilled his ceremonial duties, occasionally glancing toward the entrances and exits in ways that confirmed Elena's worst fears about his involvement. She caught his eye several times during the early part of the evening, searching his face for some sign of the brother she had grown up with, but finding only a stranger, whose ambition had corrupted everything good about his character. The international guests mingled obliviously with potential assassins, creating a surreal atmosphere where diplomatic conversations about trade agreements and cultural exchanges took place mere feet away from men planning mass murder. Elena found herself studying every face in the crowd, wondering who could be trusted and who might be part of the conspiracy that seemed to grow larger and more complex with each passing hour. As the evening progressed toward the moment when King Marcus would deliver his anniversary address, Elena felt the tension building like pressure before a thunderstorm. Captain Morrison's guards had identified several of the mercenaries and were tracking their movements, but the sheer number of guests and the complexity of the Great Hall's layout made it impossible to guarantee everyone's safety. The next hour would determine whether their hastily assembled counter-operation could prevent a massacre that would change the course of Astoria's history forever. The moment of truth arrived as King Marcus rose to deliver his anniversary address, the traditional speech that would mark the climax of the evening's celebration. Elena's heart pounded as she scanned the crowd, spotting the subtle hand signals between Captain Morrison's guards that indicated the mercenaries were moving into their planned positions. Lady Victoria stood near the main entrance, her elegant posture hiding the tension Elena now recognized as anticipation for the violence about to unfold. Prince Alexander had positioned himself strategically near the royal dais, close enough to appear protective of his father while actually ensuring he would be ready to play his role as the shocked survivor. When the attack began, Elena watched her brother check his pocket watch repeatedly, a nervous gesture that suggested the conspiracy was operating on a precise timeline that would soon reach its deadly conclusion. The king's speech began with warm words about Astoria's prosperity and the loyalty of its people, phrases that took on tragic irony given the betrayal unfolding around him. Elena maintained her composed expression while discreetly signaling Captain Morrison about suspicious movements she observed in the crowd. Two men near the eastern wall had their hands positioned near concealed weapons, while another figure by the musicians' gallery kept glancing toward Lady Victoria for instructions. As King Marcus reached the portion of his speech discussing future plans for the kingdom, Elena noticed Lady Victoria's slight nod toward the shadows near the great tapestry. The signal was subtle but unmistakable, and Elena knew that the attack was about to begin. She prepared to throw herself between the assassins and her father, understanding that the next few seconds would determine whether their family would survive the night. The first indication of trouble came from an unexpected source. Lord Edmund Hartwell, an elderly noble who had been standing near one of the mercenaries, suddenly collapsed with a cry of pain. As concerned guests rushed to help him, the commotion disrupted the carefully planned positioning of the assassins and created chaos that worked in favor of the defenders Captain Morrison had strategically placed throughout the hall. Elena seized the moment of confusion to grab her father's arm and pull him toward the reinforced alcove behind the throne, a defensive position that Captain Morrison had suggested earlier. King Marcus protested the interruption to his speech, but Elena's urgent whispers about immediate danger convinced him to follow her guidance. The movement likely saved his life, as crossbow bolts suddenly flew through the space where he had been standing just moments before. The great hall erupted into pandemonium as guests realized they were under attack. Captain Morrison's guards immediately moved to engage the mercenaries, but the confined space and presence of innocent civilians made the battle extremely dangerous for everyone involved. Elena shouted warnings to nearby dignitaries, while trying to shield her father from the violence exploding around them. Prince Alexander's reaction to the unfolding chaos revealed the true depth of his involvement in the conspiracy. Instead of moving to protect his father or help coordinate the defense, he attempted to slip away toward a side exit, confirming Elena's suspicions about his guilt. Captain Morrison had anticipated this possibility and stationed guards at all exits, preventing Alexander's escape while maintaining the security perimeter around the royal family. Lady Victoria's composed facade crumbled as her carefully orchestrated plan fell apart around her. Elena watched with grim satisfaction as the woman who had betrayed their trust attempted to blend into the crowd of panicking guests, only to find herself surrounded by loyal guards who had been tracking her movements throughout the evening. The sight of Victoria in restraints, her elegant gown torn and her perfect composure shattered, provided some measure of justice for the years of deception and manipulation. The battle in the great hall was brief but intense, with Captain Morrison's guards proving superior to the hired mercenaries in both training and motivation. The defenders were fighting to protect their king and kingdom, while the attackers were motivated only by gold and had no particular loyalty to their cause. Several mercenaries attempted to surrender when they realized their mission had failed. Though others fought desperately to escape the consequences of their actions, Elena remained with her father, in their defensive position, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and heartbreak. The immediate threat was being contained, but the revelation of her brother's betrayal and Victoria's treachery had shattered the foundation of trust that held their family together. King Marcus appeared stunned as he processed the reality that his most trusted advisor and his own son had conspired to murder him. As the last of the mercenaries was subdued, Elena helped her father to his feet and surveyed the damage to both the great hall and their lives. Several guests had been injured in the chaos, and the international implications of an assassination attempt during a diplomatic celebration would require careful management to prevent damage to Astoria's relationships with neighboring kingdoms. The night that was supposed to celebrate a decade of peaceful rule had instead exposed the corruption and ambition that threatened to destroy everything they had built. In the immediate aftermath of the failed assassination attempt, Silverstone Palace transformed into a fortress under siege as Captain Morrison implemented emergency security protocols. The Great Hall, which had hosted elegant celebrations just hours earlier, now served as a makeshift command center where investigators cataloged evidence and interrogated captured conspirators. Elena found herself thrust into a leadership role she had never sought, helping coordinate the response while her father struggled to process the magnitude of the betrayal he had suffered. King Marcus aged visibly in the hours following the attack, the weight of discovering that his most trusted advisor and his own son had plotted his murder taking a devastating toll on his spirit. Elena stayed close to him as royal physicians examined his injuries and advisors briefed him on the security situation, watching her father grapple with questions that had no easy answers. How long had the conspiracy been developing? Who else in the court could be trusted? What had driven Prince Alexander to such desperate measures? The interrogation of Lady Victoria proved particularly revealing as she maintained her composure even in defeat. She spoke candidly about her motivations, explaining that she had grown tired of serving a king she viewed as weak and indecisive during a time when Astoria faced growing threats from aggressive neighbors. Her correspondence with King Roderick of Drakmore revealed a complex web of international intrigue that extended far beyond simple palace politics. Victoria's confession painted Prince Alexander as a willing but naive participant who had been manipulated through appeals to his ambition and promises of glory. She described how she had gradually convinced him that their father was leading Astoria toward decline and that bold action was necessary to preserve the kingdom's future. Elena listened to these revelations with a heavy heart, understanding that her brother's betrayal stemmed from weakness rather than evil. Though the distinction provided little comfort, the captured mercenaries provided additional details about the scope of the conspiracy, revealing that Victoria had been planning the assassination for over 18 months. The plot had involved not just the immediate attack, but also preparations for the chaotic aftermath, including arrangements for Prince Alexander to be crowned quickly before opposition could organize. Several prominent nobles had been compromised through bribery or blackmail, creating a network of support that would have legitimized the coup. International reactions began arriving as word of the assassination attempt spread to neighboring kingdoms. Ambassador dispatches ranged from expressions of support and concern to more calculating assessments of how Astoria's internal troubles might affect regional power balances. Elena worked with senior diplomats to craft responses that projected strength while acknowledging the seriousness of the security breach that had allowed foreign mercenaries to infiltrate the royal palace. The most difficult moment came when Elena was forced to confront Prince Alexander directly about his role in the conspiracy. Her brother sat in a heavily guarded chamber, his youthful face showing the strain of realizing how completely he had been manipulated by Lady Victoria. Their conversation was painful and emotional, with Alexander alternating between defiant justifications for his actions and tearful apologies for the pain he had caused their family. Elena struggled to balance her love for her brother with her duty to the crown and the kingdom. Alexander's youth and Victoria's manipulation provided some mitigation for his crimes, but the fact remained that he had actively participated in planning their father's murder. The legal and political consequences of his actions would need to be carefully considered to prevent further damage to royal authority while satisfying the demands of justice. Captain Morrison's investigation uncovered additional evidence of Victoria's long-term embezzlement and her secret communications with hostile foreign powers. The financial records revealed that she had been systematically weakening Astoria's economic position while strengthening her own resources, creating vulnerabilities that would have made the kingdom easier to manipulate or conquer after the successful coup. Her betrayal extended far beyond personal ambition to include genuine threats to national security. As dawn broke over Silverstone Palace, Elena stood at her father's side while he addressed the kingdom about the previous night's events. King Marcus's speech was carefully crafted to acknowledge the attack while projecting confidence in the kingdom's stability and his continued ability to rule effectively. Elena watched the assembled crowd of nobles and officials, studying their reactions for signs of continued disloyalty while hoping that the worst of the crisis had passed. The speech concluded with King Marcus's announcement that Princess Elena would assume expanded responsibilities as his official heir and chief advisor, a decision that reflected both his increased reliance on her judgment and his recognition that the traditional succession might need to be reconsidered given Prince Alexander's actions. Elena accepted this new role with mixed emotions, understanding that her life had fundamentally changed in ways that would affect not only her personal future but the entire course of Astoria's history. The trial of Lady Victoria and Prince Alexander began 3 weeks after the assassination attempt, conducted in the historic Court of Royal Justice with representatives from across the kingdom serving as witnesses to the proceedings. Elena sat beside her father as the charges were read, watching the two people who had shaped her life in such different ways face the consequences of their betrayal. The formal nature of the proceedings could not diminish the personal pain of seeing family and trusted friends reduced to defendants in a treason case. King Marcus had aged significantly since the attack, his once vibrant energy replaced by a cautious wariness that colored all his interactions. Elena had gradually assumed many of his daily responsibilities as he focused on rebuilding the intelligence networks that Victoria's betrayal had compromised. The investigation had revealed that the conspiracy reached deeper into the court structure than anyone had initially realized, requiring a comprehensive review of personnel and procedures that would take months to complete. Lady Victoria's trial proceeded with clinical efficiency as prosecutors presented the overwhelming evidence of her crimes. Her financial manipulations alone would have warranted severe punishment, but the assassination plot and her treasonous communications with foreign powers elevated her case to the level of high crimes against the state. She maintained her dignity throughout the proceedings, showing no remorse for her actions, while expressing disappointment that her plans had been discovered before they could succeed. The evidence against Victoria included detailed financial records, intercepted correspondence with King Roderick's representatives, and testimony from the captured mercenaries who described her role in planning and financing the attack. Elena found herself both fascinated and disgusted by the scope of Victoria's deception, understanding that the woman who had helped raise her had been systematically betraying everything she claimed to value for years. Prince Alexander's case proved more complex due to his youth and the evidence of manipulation by Lady Victoria. Elena testified on her brother's behalf, describing how Victoria had gradually isolated him from other advisors while feeding him information designed to make their father appear weak and ineffective. The court heard testimony about Alexander's genuine love for the kingdom and his sincere belief that drastic action was necessary to preserve Astoria's future. The prosecution argued that Alexander's motivations, while perhaps understandable, could not excuse his participation in planning regicide. They presented evidence of his active role in gathering intelligence about palace security and his willing acceptance of payment for his cooperation. Elena watched her brother struggle with the weight of his actions as witness after witness described his involvement in the conspiracy that could have destroyed their entire family. International observers attended the trial to assess how King Marcus would handle this unprecedented crisis of royal authority. The verdicts would send important signals about Astoria's stability and the rule of law within the kingdom. Several neighboring monarchs had expressed concern about the precedent of prosecuting members of the royal family, while others argued that accountability was essential for maintaining legitimate government. The court delivered its verdicts after 5 days of testimony and deliberation. Lady Victoria was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment with forfeiture of all property and titles. Her punishment included exile from Astoria. Once her prison term was completed, ensuring that she would never again pose a threat to the kingdom's security. The sentence reflected both the severity of her crimes and the court's recognition that execution might create additional political complications. Prince Alexander's case resulted in a more nuanced verdict that acknowledged both his guilt and the mitigating circumstances of his youth and manipulation. He was found guilty of treason but sentenced to 20 years imprisonment followed by permanent exile from the kingdom. The court recommended that he serve his sentence in comfortable confinement befitting his royal birth, with opportunities for education and reflection that might help him understand the magnitude of his errors. King Marcus's response to the verdicts demonstrated the wisdom and mercy that had characterized his reign before the crisis began. He announced that he accepted the court's decisions while expressing his personal forgiveness for both Victoria and Alexander, emphasizing that justice had been served without destroying the principles of compassion that defined Astoria's legal system. His statement helped heal some of the divisions that the trial had created within the kingdom. Elena's role in preventing the assassination and her testimony during the trial had elevated her standing both within the court and among the general population. King Marcus formally designated her as crown princess and heir apparent, a decision that reflected both practical necessity and his recognition of her demonstrated wisdom and loyalty. The announcement was met with widespread approval from nobles and commoners alike who had been impressed by her courage and intelligence throughout the crisis. The conclusion of the trials marked the beginning of a new chapter in Astoria's history, with Elena gradually assuming greater responsibilities while her father focused on diplomatic efforts to repair relationships damaged by the revelation of foreign involvement in the conspiracy. The kingdom emerged from its crisis stronger and more unified, having survived a test that could have destroyed everything they had built together. In the months that followed, Elena would often reflect on the night that changed everything, understanding that the betrayal of trust she had witnessed had taught her valuable lessons about leadership and the price of power. The kingdom of Astoria would continue to prosper under her eventual rule, guided by the hard-earned wisdom that sometimes the greatest threats come from those closest to the throne,